What if I told you that every culture operates by a code, an unseen force shaping thought, emotion, and survival itself? Culture isn't just what we wear, what we eat, or how we speak. And what if I told you that the European culture was built on a code of separation and control? You exist within a story that was written long before you were born, a story that dictates how you see yourself, how you move, and even how you think and feel. But what if that story was never meant for your freedom? To reclaim your mind, you must first understand the forces that shaped it. So today, we return to our African center to break down the cultural codes we now know no longer serve our best interests. This is Afrosynthesis. Ankin Ma'at, Hotel, Peace, what's happening world? I'm Ahasa. This is Afrosynthesis, and welcome back to the channel. As you can see from the title, this episode, right, is number 21, and we're talking about going from the seed to the structure, and we're talking about the foundation of culture. And so, of course, to begin, I want to mention some definitions of culture that I enjoy. The first one is by a gentleman, a great warrior scholar of ours named Professor James Smalls. He says that culture is an expression of the understanding of your divinity. I'm going to say it again. Culture is an expression of the understanding of your divinity. The head priest, the Nasut Biti of the Temple of Anu, he defines culture as survival strategies to help inform your reality. And a definition of culture that I have written for myself is that culture is a self-generating fabric of thought and energy that informs the reality of a people's collective consciousness. And so when I look at the string in the fabric that connects all of these definitions, I see that the truth is that to understand culture, you must understand culture as a function, as a living entity that informs all aspects of how its development plays out. And so today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how we can understand a culture, how we can analyze it, how we can evaluate it, and how we can synthesize it. And in order to do that, we're going to also have to use some different languages, right? Because language exists within the culture itself. And so if you're trying to pull yourself out of the matrix, you're going to need some other language or some words that exist outside of that culture that you're looking to break down so that you can anchor yourself to it. And so who we're going to be speaking about today and leaning on is our great warrior scholar. Her name is Dr. Marimba Ani. She wrote a book entitled Yurugu, and Yurugu introduces a framework for understanding cultural ideology. And so she identifies three concepts that are key to understanding the structure of any culture. The first is Asili. And the Asili is the germinating matrix or the ideological seed of a culture, right? The Asili is the core idea or the seed of a culture that shapes how a group of people think, live, and create, right? You could say the Asili is the DNA of the culture. So if we were to break this down a little bit, let's think of the Asili of an apple tree. The Asili of an apple tree is to be a tree that produces apples. Naturally, then you could understand that the Asili of an apple tree is going to be different than an Asili of a pear tree. They have something in common. They are both looking to grow into trees, but they also have something very different. One is looking to grow and to be an apple. One is looking to grow to produce a fruit that would be a pear. Even when you think about a fruit, the center of a fruit is called its core. and the core has a seed. And if that seed falls into some soil and gets watered and loved and nutrition, it's going to do what? It's going to grow and reproduce itself again and multiply. That's what the Asili is. It's the central core of the culture. Then you have the Utamawazo. The Utamawazo is the culturally structured thought or the worldview that ensures that the Asili is realized, right? And so this is how a culture teaches its people to think about the world that they live in. Imagine the Utamawazo is like the cultural lenses, the cultural glasses that its members wear and are born with, through which they see life and shape their values, their actions, and their beliefs. And then the third word is going to be Utamaroho. The Utamaroho is the vital force of a culture. It is the energy that gives its culture its tone and drives the collective behavior, right? And so this is the Utamaroho. It's like the spirit that gives the culture its unique essence, making its people feel connected and feel motivated to even live out their culture in daily life. Okay, and so these three elements, they're not separate. They all stem from the Asili. And they're all purposeful in reinforcing its presence in all action, beliefs, and institutions created. So as we get into exploring the Asili of the European culture, we find that it's unique in its assertion of its political interests. We talked about politics a little last week, right? It's a relationship or the philosophy of a people's relations to other people. And so, according to Mama Marimba Ani, the Asili of the European culture is built on two primary principles: separation and control. And we can see this manifesting in our lives through the dichotomies that European cultures and civilizations and societies make so prevalent, right? Man versus woman, or human versus nature. European versus the other when you look at their psychological practices. Thought versus emotion. Zeros or ones, right? Like it's all very exclusory, is that a word? Like it's all very exclusionary, and that's for domination and control purposes, right? Even when we look at this binary approach, we can see that it doesn't fully align with nature, right? Let's just take the zeros and ones. If life was about zeros and ones, how do we get back to zero? By that I mean, if there's a zero here and there's a one here, how does the one get back to zero if there's only zeros and ones? You need a -1 for the one to even get back to zero. And so simple math even exposes some of the flaws in this ideology, in the Asili. And so the Utamawazo, that's the European culturally structured thought. And it shapes the ideology and even the literal, like down to our cells, the biocultural experience, because it's to ensure that the Asili remains intact. Meanwhile, the Utamaroho of the European ideology, its vital force is domination. And that manifests in the institutions, the economies, and even the global policies that perpetuate the control. And so in order to transmute and this cultural process, we have to understand and get a little deeper into what is the process of culture coming into being. And so there's a gentleman, his name is Robert Armstrong, and he's introduced a concept that he calls primal consciousness, right? And he says that primal consciousness is this inherent awareness that is shaping people and how they experience the world. And so he calls that the mythoform, right? He says that cultural seeds grow out of the societies that they're in through the people that they've been planted in. And so culture moves in 3 stages. The first is the mythoform or the mythoform. Think like, it sounds like mythology, but that's going to be step 2. The mythoform is step 1. That's the deep, preconscious foundation of a culture. It's the unspoken energy that's guiding your perception. Then you have step 2, which is the mythology. And so as the mythoform begins to take shape, it becomes mythology. It becomes stories and symbols and traditions. And those stories and symbols, they unify people by having, right, a shared narrative. When I see that symbol, I have an understanding of what it is, just like this person does. That puts me and this person in the same cultural understanding and reality. And so once you go from the mythoform to the mythology, you then move to ideology. Over time, right, mythology evolves into ideology, where the cultural symbols are used politically and socially to defend, to construct, and to project the power. And so this isn't linear or hierarchical. It is a manifestation of the Asili. And so we have some illuminating that we need to do, right? We have to talk about the impact that these different realities have on its members, or the impact that these members have on others who maybe aren't in their membership. So the Asili of European culture, as we mentioned, Mama Marimba Ani says, is built on separation and control, and it has shaped the global institutions and policies in ways that continue to impact many communities, especially African and indigenous communities, right? We see an erosion of policies that are meant to correct historical inequities, right? And so let's talk about the rise of Donald Trump. When we start to break down the Asili, when we look at the culturally structured thought and the vital force of the cultural, like, emotional dimension of the European seed, we see that Donald Trump is not random. He is literally a genetic response to a fear of needing to survive, right? So this destruction of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the corporate and educational level, that is because there's literally a threat in the Utamaroho and the Utamawazo of this Asili being potent and being powerful in the soil that it's been planted in here in the United States. And so the suppression of DEI efforts is not an isolated event at all. It actually reflects a broader historical and cultural pattern of needing to maintain dominance and therefore eliminating structures that are providing for the upliftment of another Asili. Like Miss Stacey Patton, she's a journalist, and she has written that Donald Trump is the embodiment of a biological and genetic threat. And so the Asili of the European way is breaking down. And Donald Trump is the living reality of what its culturally structured thought is supposed to do in the first place, right? Remember, in our definition of Asili, we say that the culturally structured thought or worldview is to ensure that its Asili is realized. And so if he sees his cultural worldview as dying and no one is taking up the helm and to do so, he is literally responding to his genetic and cultural DNA, which says to do something about our lack of control and separation. We are becoming too intermixed with other people. We need to separate. We are beginning to lose our control. We need more domination, right? And so similarly, there are many people who might say that they don't agree with Donald Trump, but emotionally they're still moving in support of him. And so that's because maybe, even though they've maybe disconnected from the Utamawazo, the culturally structured thought of the Asili, they're still connected to the Utamaroho, to the vital force and the energy that gives its culture its tone and does what? Drive its collective behavior. And so though they aren't being driven by the thought, they are certainly being moved by the vital force, which is its energetic dimensions. So in closing, culture is not just what we do. It is who we are, how we think, why we feel the way we feel about the things we feel about. And it's also what we believe is even possible. And so understanding the Asili of our culture gives us the power to shape our reality consciously. Does that make a little more sense now about how mythoform goes to mythology, which is signs and symbols, which then goes to ideology, which is how you are consciously and intentionally moving through your reality. Right? And so a final word that I want to introduce you to that Mama Marimba Ani brought to us is the word ma'afa. First, Asili, Utamaroho, and Utamawazo, as well as ma'afa, these four words, they are all from the Kiswahili language, or some people just understand it as the Swahili language. The Kiswahili term ma'afa means great disaster. And so the great disaster, the ma'afa, is the transatlantic slave trade and this ongoing system of oppression that is being directed across the world. As I look around, like it's being directed across the world as a result of the European Asili. Right? Last week we talked about ma'ocracy. In contrast, African-centered thinkers advocate for an Asili that is rooted in interconnectedness, interdependence, harmony, and collective growth, aka ma'at. Truth, justice, balance, order, harmony, righteousness, and reciprocity. Yeah. So the ma'afa, the great tragedy that we are experiencing, is that for the last couple thousand years, we have been uprooted from our cultural soil, and we've had seeds of another culture planted and watered and growing within us. So we have some weeding out to do as far as tending to our internal cultural garden is concerned. And so recognizing and redefining our Asili allows us to reclaim our cultural identity and truly determine for ourselves what our future is going to be. And so the question that I have for reflection for us is this: what is the Asili that governs your world? And I also have a call to action for us. I want us to engage with this concept of Asili and examine for your own self what is the current cultural framework that you are operating with, right? Ask yourself question number 1 or question number 2. How do you see the principles of Asili, Utamawazo, and Utamaroho at work in your world? And so honestly, I know if you wrote those 2 down, or if you're listening, to give you a structure, I would say ask yourself 1, how do you think? Or if I'm writing this for myself, I would say, how do I think? My second question I would ask myself is, how is the way that I feel based on the way that I think? And then the third question I would ask myself is, what does the way I think and the way I feel tell me about my core? What does it tell me about my own Asili? And then based on this knowledge, ask yourself one final question. What needs to be weeded out so that you can become the person that you want to be? Right? And of course, like, if you've made it to the end, I appreciate it. Don't forget, like, go ahead, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that we can continue this journey of decolonization and re-Africanization together. Like, as always, it is a pleasure to share with you all in community, and I'll see you next week. So it is, and so shall it be.